Hi Joe, how are you?
Good afternoon, Prerna. It's lovely to be back on your show.
Lovely to have you. How's your weekend been so far?
It's been fabulous. I went to a birthday party last night, which was absolutely fantastic. A fellow lawyer of mine had her 50th birthday, and it had everyone and anyone there who were friends of hers, and it was a really good time. So I'm in a very good mood today.
Yeah, sun's shining.
It's shining outside for the first time in a very long time in this lovely country of ours. And
it feels like summer's here already.
It does feel like that. It's good to see that we've got a nice topic to kick off the sunshine with, which is going to be of, I think, real interest to people out there who are listening.
Definitely, and today we'll be talking about religious schools. Now, my understanding of religious schools, there are two types. One's funded by the state and the other is privately funded. And you were a counsellor for a while, so to become a religious school, would you have to get approval by the council? Is that correct?
Well, all religious schools obviously have to be subject to certain laws in this country. And we have at the moment, interestingly, about 1/3 of state-funded schools in the UK are in fact faith schools, as we call them, rather than religious schools.
It's a huge number.
It's a very substantial number, and I think this is the reason why this particular topic has become quite interesting and potentially very controversial, because we're living in an era now where two things are going on which are causing real concern amongst the public. One is, of course, the issue of religion and a multi-faith society, and whether or not we are operating harmoniously, or in fact are we harbouring problems for the future. And the other issue is, of course, pressure on government resources, because it's an era of austerity.
Definitely.
And I think at times like this, the public are rightly concerned to know how their money is being spent. And so we have these two issues coming together, and I think there is an important debate we need to engage in. And the debate really can be summarised in this fashion. For many, many years, in fact for several hundred years, the church, particularly in this country, has had a role to play in education, because there are many, many church schools which are funded by the state. And of course, since immigrants have come here over the last 50 or 60 years, over a very slow process, we've seen an increasing number of faith schools from other religious communities as well.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a deep question that we need to ask ourselves as citizens of this country. And it's this, it's what sort of children are we trying to develop and bring along? What sort of mindset are we creating in our young people? Are we looking to instill in our younger generation a sense of citizenship which doesn't have any religious colour? Or is it a situation in which religion is going to play an increasingly prominent part in the minds of younger people, and may in fact affect the way that they see the rest of the community around them? And I think this is essentially a discussion about what is a good society.
Definitely.
Do you want a society which is defined by religion, individual religious affiliation, or do you want a society in which people feel an obligation to their community generally, irrespective of other people's religions, and an obligation, of course, to their country, which they choose to live in? And I think, Prerna, in past discussions that you and I have had on this show, we've touched upon this from different angles, and we've spoken about the effect of extremism upon community cohesion. Now we're moving on to something which is a very touchy subject for lots of people, and that's how you educate your own children. And I think both you and I agree on one particular thing, which is that we don't believe that anyone's religion should be sidelined. It's not a question of religion taking second place. People feel, to varying degrees, very passionate and strong feelings about their religious attachments.
Exactly.
And parents have a responsibility to bring their children up in the way that they see fit. And so the state shouldn't have too much of a role to play in how children are brought up. That's essentially a parental role. But the state does have a responsibility in ensuring that we have stability and cohesion throughout our communities. And if there is, in fact, a growing conflict, which I sense there is, between what individual families and what parents want for their children, and what others who have other ideas about what a good society should look like believe in, then we are storing up a problem which will eventually, I fear, erupt in other ways. And we've seen examples of this, haven't we, Prerna, in Northern Ireland?
Yeah.
Because in Northern Ireland for many, many decades, in fact longer than that, Catholic children and Protestant children have been almost exclusively educated in schools which are either Catholic or Protestant. And we've seen the effect of that on community cohesion in Northern Ireland, where you have effectively segregation. Now, we talk about segregation in the past in South Africa, segregation in America before the Civil Rights Movement, segregation in other countries where people have been divided upon racial lines. And we've had, of course, segregation in religious terms in other parts of the world too. But even on our doorstep in Northern Ireland, we have direct and immediate evidence of the very bad impact it can have on communities if you separate children from the youngest age and instill in them an idea that they are primarily, for example, Catholic or primarily Protestant. It is very difficult to undo the damage that that causes to children when in later life they try to integrate with people from other faith communities but find it extremely difficult because of the mindset that they've been brought up in.
No, definitely. I mean, it goes back to a show we did a couple of months ago on secularism, and is Britain a secular society? And we found actually religion does still play quite a big role in the UK. I mean, the Queen swears allegiance to the Church of England. We have bishops in the House of Lords. So, I don't know, but it goes back to what you were saying with the immigrant community coming to the UK and Britain being a multicultural society. If we see so many Church of England schools, other communities would think, well, you know, if the Church of England can have their schools as Catholic schools, why can't our community have something as well? So I think it's always like, oh, they're doing it, so let's do it as well. And sometimes we kind of forget to see the impact it does have on children growing up.
This is where we can't see the wood for the trees, because as you've quite rightly said, Prerna, we've become so steeped and embroiled in this sterile debate about the fact that other people have religious schools or faith schools, and small communities begin to feel incredibly insecure and defensive and feel that the only way that they can provide an antidote to that is to have faith schools of their own. They may not in fact start thinking that at the beginning, but they feel pushed into that position, if only to, as they say it, protect their own children from the influences of other religions.
Definitely.
And it's very interesting that you've had this discussion previously, because although it's right to say that religion plays a part in our society here in the UK, all the evidence is pointing to the fact that religious affiliation, certainly within the Christian church, has become looser and looser and weaker.
Yeah.
So there are fewer people, as we know, who attend church on Sundays. But at the same time, because we have 1/3 of our schools being state-funded, having a faith identity, we have this strange phenomenon developing where parents, particularly middle-class parents, who want their children to go to the local faith school because it produces outstanding exam results, are rediscovering, quote-unquote, their religious attachment to the church.
So it's quite convenient.
Very convenient. And so I'm not saying that, of course, for a moment that all parents who have their children at faith schools, particularly Christian faith schools, are doing this cynically. But we know, because there is a lower and lower attendance at church, and in fact most people, Anglicans were asked this question not so long ago, of the most important 10 things that they would want their children to inherit from them as parents, where does religion fit in? And only about 11% felt that religion was something so important that they wanted to pass it on to their children.
I can imagine.
And yet we know, of course, that the subscription level and application level for faith schools, Christian faith schools, for example, which are the majority faith schools in this country, are extremely high. And there's a reason for that, because we need to deal with this, what seems to be a dilemma, but also seems to be a bit of obfuscation. Some people think that the reason why faith schools should be preserved is because they produce really good exam results, or many of them do at least.
Okay.
Now, is that because they are a faith school? Or in fact, is that because they are permitted under our law to be discriminatory in the children that they accept? And so where you have faith schools which say, look, if you want to come here, you as parents need to demonstrate that you've been going to your local church.
Yeah, and there's an interview process as well, which isn't this case with other state schools.
Absolutely. So we have effectively a selection system for faith schools. And wherever you have a selection system, don't be surprised to discover that the schools are sifting out children that they don't think are going to perform so well academically. So, for example, children who have special needs, or children who come from lower income groups, who may be getting free school meals. Those schools which are faith schools are given much more freedom to discriminate against children and their parents on the basis of faith than an ordinary state school which doesn't have a faith identity would be permitted to do. And so we have a problem, Prerna, with our legislation, because our legislation is in desperate need of being brought up to date.
Definitely.
There's a problem of discrimination not just against children of, quote-unquote, the wrong faith, getting into the local school which is doing academically very well, which is unfair on those children, isn't it, really? There's also discrimination potentially against teachers who want to join certain schools, and they will be prevented from doing so if they can't show that they are, in fact, a member of that faith. So here we have a virtuous, self-fulfilling situation where the schools which are doing it academically well, who happen to be faith schools, are getting money from the government, which means taxpayers like you and I are funding them. They are operating selective processes in the children that they accept. They are screening out children who would not help their exam results. Those schools then become more and more well-established and popular in the local communities.
But then not everyone can go to them, unfortunately.
Not everyone
so
can
it
go
is
to
quite
them.
discriminatory.
Isn't
so we're
it?
kind of funding these schools which discriminate against other people.
And that's the question you started with, is where you've got state schools effectively funded by the taxpayer, which are promoting one particular religion or faith. Why should we generally, as a society, be paying for that? If communities want to have faith schools, then they can pay for it themselves. Why should other people pay for it?
Yeah,
now,
that's
I
true.
understand the complaint that's made, which is the one that you mentioned, which is when smaller religious faiths, whether it's, Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, Jews, say, well, Christians have been doing this for many, many years. It's
Yeah.
really unfair that we're excluded. We need to have government funding as well. Well, my answer to that is the solution is not to extend government funding even further to include other faiths as well. The solution is to stop government funding of all faith schools so that we stop this segregation which is taking place at a very early age in children's development and allow them to flourish amongst other children of different faiths. And can I give you one simple example? And
Yeah.
it's a very personal one. The school that I have been chairing as chair of governors for the last 17 years in Southall, which, as you know, is an area with a high Asian concentration,
Yes.
is a school when I started there a very long time ago in the early 70s, which was located in a multi-faith community. It wasn't quite as homogeneous as it is now. We had Christians, we had Muslims, we had Hindus, we had Sikhs. We had all the faiths well represented at that school. And Prerna, I can tell you, as a child, sitting in a classroom as a 5- and 6-year-old, going up to the time that I left that school, I had no idea whatsoever that the child sitting to my left was a Muslim and the child sitting to my right was a Hindu and that I
Yeah.
was a Sikh. Because we weren't trained to think in terms of our religious identity.
Definitely.
We were children learning in a warm, supportive learning environment about the world around us and about the fact that the world was made up of many, many faiths indeed. And we gave equal respect to all these faiths. We didn't have a pecking order. We didn't say to people, as happens in faith schools, that, look, I come from this faith, I believe my faith is the best faith in the world.
Yeah.
Because the minute you start talking in terms of my faith is the best faith in the world, by definition you're saying that other faiths are inferior.
Yeah.
And it's a very short step, Prerna, from that position, that sort of intellectual position when you're a young child, to start thinking, I don't respect other religions. I don't care for other religions. My religion is the best. And we've got to ensure that if we want to work together cohesively as a society, we don't allow that system of thinking to creep into young minds. What do we want? We want young minds at school to be independent, to be critical, to question things. We don't want our children to come out of schools like robots. We want them to think for themselves. And the only way that you can develop and nurture that sense in young people is to allow them to keep their minds open. The minute you start closing their minds and saying only one system of thinking and one system of values is the correct one, this is where dogma creeps in and children become intolerant of other people. And I've seen that. Evidence is all around us of where that's happening. And in my own school, where I've been chair of governors, I've been absolutely committed to the principle that every child who steps in through the school gate in my school feels that their place is as equal to anyone else's place. And it's a secular school. That's why it works. But if I was the governor of a faith school, I would have a huge problem in trying to stop parents from beginning to dominate everything and saying that, no, you as the chair of governors or you as the head teacher should be instilling only one system of values into our children. I think that's the rocky road to ruin. That's where a community falls into disintegration. I think you and I can see that happening now in the UK in 2014 as people become more entrenched. And I think there's a responsibility upon all right-thinking people to say, look, religion is a private matter. Religion is for families. We respect all religions. We don't want any religious faith to feel that they are being marginalized or sidelined. But we have to recognize that in parts of society which are essentially places where people can meet together on an equal footing, such as education, health, the civil service, whatever else it may be, it's important to keep religion where it belongs, which is in its right place in the home, in the mosque, in the temple.
So it's something that's
in
very
the Gurdwara.
personal, religion.
Yes, it's a personal matter. And if people want to send their children after school to the local Gurdwara or the temple or the mosque for religious instruction, they should absolutely be free to do that. But where schools are concerned, that should be, in a sense, in my view at least, a religious-free zone.
We've got a couple of texts come in. I'll just read some out. We've had a text from Rita who said, nothing wrong with religious schools. I went to a Catholic school and I'm a Hindu. I did not convert or get tainted. I had a fabulous education with discipline, manners and respect for everyone. So thank you very much for your text, Rita.
That's a very interesting point from Rita, because, of course, as Rita herself recognises, as a Hindu in a Catholic school, she would have been in a minority. Because, as we know, faith schools allow a small proportion of their intake to be from other religions. And with all due respect to Rita, my own view is that that's just paying lip service. That's their way of saying, we're not intolerant. Look, 10%, 15% of our intake are from other faiths. But the reality of it, which we need to recognise, and I hope that Rita will value the point that we're making here, is that if the dominant religion in that school is Catholicism, what it's saying to the vast majority of children in that school, not Rita because she's a Hindu, but to the vast majority of children in that school is, you are a Catholic who happens to be British, rather than you're British who happens to be Catholic. And I think
religion would come first.
Yes, I think that's where we're getting things the wrong way around.
And we also had a text from Sundar so that all faith schools have to take children from all religions. So I think we've just addressed that point, that faith schools, whilst they do have to take children from all religions, they can give priority to applicants who are the faith of that school.
Well, the point there, which is absolutely vital to drive home, is where schools are oversubscribed, the law allows them to discriminate against people who are of the, quote, wrong religion. And I think it's easy to say all schools have to take in people from different faiths, but the point here is these schools who are selective and who are therefore, generally speaking, more successful academically, are more popular in their communities. They are oversubscribed, but to get into those schools, you have to jump through a number of hoops. And it's all well and good saying that they open their doors to other faiths, but the truth of the matter is, because they're oversubscribed, the law allows them to discriminate.
Yeah, they can only take people from other faiths if they're undersubscribed and they've got places to fill.
Well, and if they have a quota system to allow a certain proportion of other faiths, which I've dealt with in terms of it's a minority presence like Rita.
Yeah.
Okay, but the overwhelming ethos of the school will be Catholic or Muslim or Sikh or Hindu or whatever else it happens to be.
Vinod has texted in as well. He said, if a school follows a national curriculum, it doesn't matter whether it's a faith school or mainstream. I mean, religious schools, they do have to follow the national curriculum and have national curriculum tests and assessments. They're also inspected by Ofsted. And so, yeah, I mean, they do follow the national curriculum, but I think the point is that they're allowed to have an overwhelming amount of their timetable dominated by the religion of that school.
That is precisely the point. Again, it comes back to this question of, is it lip service? Or in reality, on the ground, in classrooms, are we saying that schools which are faith schools, because they're teaching the national curriculum and have to teach about other religions as well, are they being equally balanced? Do we want an equally balanced society? Do we want a society in which all religions are equally valued? We know, of course, in reality, faith schools will press and push for their own faith being the most important one, whether it's in assembly or whether it's to do with religious celebrations or anything else. And so there's a vast difference between what on paper sounds like a very fair and equitable arrangement, but in reality and in practice, what actually goes on in faith schools is something rather different. And I think you know, Prerna, there's been some real interest in this topic over the course of the last week, because just in the news, listeners may have picked up on, was a fascinating story about a Jewish school. And it's a Jewish school in which the school had taken a decision that it was okay for the teachers to get a black marker pen and start crossing out on exam papers any questions or reference to evolution.
Wow.
Because in their view, evolution, Darwin's theory of evolution, is a nonsense. They don't believe in evolution. They believe, obviously, because of their own faith, that the world was made in 7 days. And so questions about evolution and to do with biology were being redacted out. So that means a black marker pen was being used. It's the Hezadeh HaTorah Jewish school. And it came to the attention of the media and got some publicity this week because people were outraged and they thought, look, we are living in the 21st century. It is perfectly proper for a community to want to teach their children that their religious text is the best way to interpret and understand the world, and to love God. That's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
But when you start telling children you can't learn about things like evolution or certain aspects of biology because it offends that particular religion's belief systems, we are going to end up producing a generation of children who are left in the dark, who are ignorant about some of the fundamental things that we take in society these days as important pieces of knowledge. And we can't afford that, because we can't produce a society which has children who have only a partial understanding of the world.
And it gives them, it's really unfair. I mean, because when they grow up and, you know, speak to other people, they'll be clueless about certain things because they weren't allowed to, you know, have it taught to them.
Yes, and no doubt, Prerna, what will happen is not only will they feel clueless or left out, but then they'll retreat and become more entrenched into their own religious belief systems, which will only make the situation worse, because they'll end up having arguments with people. And the argument's not based upon shared knowledge. The arguments are based upon partial knowledge.
Yeah.
And that's not going to produce what you and I are trying to do, which is a reasonable conversation. It's going to produce a very unreasonable and ill-informed conversation.
There was also a school, I think people might have heard about this, Al Medina in Derby, which was segregating people by gender. So the girls had to sit at the back of the classroom, and all members of staff, including non-Muslims, had to wear a hijab. So if people were brought up in that kind of environment, that kind of school, they'll think that this is normal. So when they, it'd be hard for them to integrate later on in universities or other paths of life, because they'd always be used to sitting at the back or being taught a certain way.
Well, the case of the school, there was a school, in fact, in Leicester, which was the Medina Schools Federation, which was in the news as well. And it was because it was an Islamic boys' school, and an advertisement was put out for new teachers, and it was made very clear that the teachers that they wanted could only be male. So the advert said a male science teacher, and there was another advert for a male ICT technician. And in other schools, which with the Medina Girls' School, it said that there should be female-only teachers.
Okay.
And this was investigated by the Department of Education, who said, and I quote, "There did not appear to be any justification as to why these post holders would need to be of a particular sex." Now, this is where the crunch, we arrive at really the nub of the problem, okay?
Yeah.
Now, Prerna, I've spent my life trying to fight discrimination, whether it's against race or against sex or disability or anybody else who comes from a part of society which is particularly vulnerable because they've not been given fair opportunities to progress with their lives. And I've spent my entire life doing that. Until today, as co-chair of the Society of Asian Lawyers, we see it as our responsibility to challenge discrimination. We want to see a society in which women are able to participate fully in all aspects of society and shouldn't be excluded, and neither should men for that matter.
Definitely.
And minorities should be given every opportunity to move forward. Now, when you have a situation in which people are being told, don't apply for this job unless you're a man, or don't apply for this job unless you're a female, it runs completely counter to everything that those of us who have been trying to make society progressive actually believe in. That is to do with equal rights for everyone. And I think where you have faith schools operating practices which violate fundamental human rights in this country, the right of a woman to be able to take up a job in a school as a qualified teacher is a fundamental right of that woman, then we have to start asking some searching questions. And the point here is that faith schools often believe that they can do this, get away with this in a sense, because the government's legislation as it exists now permits discrimination. It permits discrimination in faith schools in the recruitment of teachers.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
where that discrimination begins to clash with the Sex Discrimination Act, then the government has an almighty headache. But the government and previous governments have created this headache for themselves because they continue to fund, as I've said, 1/3 of all state schools are faith schools in this country, 1 in 3. And they continue to fund schools, and they continue to allow these schools to discriminate in the selection of pupils and discriminate in the selection of teachers. And when those faith schools say, well, thank you very much for allowing us to do this, we'd now like to only have male teachers, or we'd like to only have white teachers, or we'd like to only have Catholic teachers. You are creating a problem in a society which needs to be stopped, and you know how to stop it as a government by withdrawing funding from these schools so that we don't have this problem persisting. I would like to see, and I make this point as a general appeal to all those parents who live in communities where their child is not of a certain faith, but the local school, which is an outstanding school, happens to be a faith school and gets their children with great, GCSE results and great A-level results, that those parents who are left out are not finding that their children's life chances are severely compromised in the future, so that child may not get the best qualifications, the best standards of teaching, and go on to get great careers because they are the wrong faith. Could you imagine a more absurd situation in a modern 21st century society where some people, and it's a lot of people, because we're talking about, 1/3 potentially of our society, because 1/3 of schools are faith schools, being told, I'm so sorry, your son or your daughter is not going to have the same life chances as another child who happens to be Catholic or Hindu or Sikh or Muslim, because your child is from the wrong religion and we won't have them in our school because we're oversubscribed and we're shutting the doors on your child. How heartbreaking for those parents.
Terrible.
It is terrible. And the
really, parents are funding them as well through the taxpayer.
And those parents, exactly, those same parents who are working hard are finding it's their tax money that's funding that school which is down the road that their child can't go to. Isn't that an absurdity? And I'd welcome anyone to ring in and say why they think that actually is a position that can be defended in a 21st century society.
Exactly. So not only are we funding, discrimination based on religion, but we're also funding discrimination based on gender, which I think is completely absurd. I mean, for everyone that knows, yesterday was International Women's Day, and women around the world have to fight so hard for equality and justice, and to hear that this is happening on our own doorstep in, a democratic, free society in the UK, I just think it's terrible. It shouldn't be allowed to happen.
It shouldn't be allowed to happen. It shouldn't be either down to those societies or groups who are ever watchful of protecting human rights to challenge decisions like the one we mentioned about only men can apply to a certain school in Leicester. It shouldn't be down to them.
No.
It should be down to legislation prohibiting that sort of behaviour so clearly that no school would ever dare to do that. And if they did dare to do that, that they would be challenged and they would be taken through the courts and they would be sued for that sort of behaviour.
Yeah.
It's very important. And here's the point. Prerna, as a lawyer, someone who's been a practicing barrister for the last 20 years, I tend to be more finely attuned to the way in which our laws sometimes overlap with each other and sometimes collide with each other. And here we have a classic case. We have a Race Discrimination Act, we have a Sex Discrimination Act, we have laws that protect people's religious freedoms and prevent people from being religiously discriminated against.
We have the Human Rights Act as well.
We have a Human Rights Act. And yet, alongside all of that, the government continually accepts that on its statute book should be legislation within the Education Act that allows faith schools to discriminate against teachers who are quote-unquote of the wrong religion and children who are quote-unquote of the wrong religion into their schools when it comes to recruitment. And I think this is completely intolerable. As a sensible, grown-up, modern society, we should be welcoming to everybody. And if you want to produce peace, harmony in the future, if you want to get young people to look at each other and say, I respect you irrespective of your religion, I accept who you are, then you need to get rid of this problem in society, which is growing like a cancer, in taking further and further steps into places which we felt and always thought were religious-free zones. And I think this is really the issue, and we need to deal with it, and we need to deal with it quickly before it spirals out of control.
No, definitely. The figures are quite shocking. I can't believe this is... all of this still happens in the UK. We've had a couple of texts come in. Balwinder Singh from Dagenham said, we used to do religious education for 2 hours a week, and I feel that used to be enough back in the 70s. So 2 hours a week, I remember doing religious education, I think once a week as well, and that was more than enough. Sometimes in assembly we would sing hymns, but that would be, the end of it. I think having a school where you do have the national curriculum, but a large amount of school time is dedicated to religion, I think it could be too much.
No one is stopping anyone from trying to ensure that their children love their faith. No one is saying that atheism should rule the day. No one is saying that religion has no part to play. Quite the opposite. If you believe, like I do, in human rights, then you believe that everyone should have the right freely to express their religion and practice it without the state interfering. But the state does not have an obligation to promote religious divides. And this is what we have at the moment. There's a fundamental difference of point of view between people like yourself and myself and others who think, actually, I want the state to pay for me to be able to teach my children only one religion in a school environment. Deal with it outside the school gates, deal with it in the home, deal with it in the temple, in the mosque, in the gurdwara, in the church. but don't deal with it in school. That's a place where children should be free to think for themselves.
Definitely. We've got a caller on the air. Bharat? Hi, Bharat. How are you?
Hi, not bad.
Thank you for calling in. I think the line's a bit fuzzy. Hello?
Hi, yeah, sorry, I'm calling from a car and the Bluetooth, so I hope that the sound is not distorted.
Oh, it's okay. Thank you for calling. Would you like to ask us a question, or do you have any comments?
Yes, I just got the gist of what we are discussing, and I understand the very good comments one of your hosts made is that people are paying taxes in the local area.
Yeah, that's correct.
That just proves that it is like the other case. Just because like we don't discriminate against someone who's got a heart condition and someone who's healthy. In the same way, education is universal. I go back to my days in Bombay where I studied in a municipal school, and we had people of all faiths, both on the student side as well as the teaching side. And bearing in mind that Bombay perhaps has got more cosmopolitan society than in London, especially very ex-Muslims or Hindus or Christians, I felt very comfortable in that environment. And coming back here in East London, where we find, I was recently involved in the campaign for the Avanti school in Barkingside.
Okay.
When the school inspectorate made the decision, one thing which came loud and clear from the performance of the Al-Noor Foundation was that they quite categorically said that they would not accept anybody from the non-Abrahamic faith.
Okay, so that's the Avanti school?
Yeah, no, the Al-Noor.
Oh, okay, Al-Noor.
Who are opposing the Avanti school supporters.
Okay.
And once the school inspectorate granted the school to Avanti, and I'm very proud of that, because basically we say that we are all inclusive.
Oh, that's really good.
Yes, we welcome people from all walks of life, regardless of their religion.
Well, that's fantastic. I'm glad the Avanti school are doing that.
Yes, so an example, once again promoted by the Hindus in this country, as to how to tackle with the idea of a single faith school. And yes, my company where I work for, we were also involved in the refurbishment of the school, and I can see 2 years down the line, Barkingside has got the chance of for the Hindu parents and for that matter people from any other religion to go and attend. If you are living locally, you can attend the school. If you don't feel comfortable, you can go to a state school.
Okay.
But I don't think the way they're promoting certain groups for their own ends, promote their own particular religion, and they go for a single faith school, it washes with 21st century Britain.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your call, Bharat. Thank you very much. That's some interesting points at the NHS, because it's all paid by taxes, and everyone can use the NHS. But I think with religious schools, whilst we do pay for it, not everyone can always access it. I mean, Bharat, you did mention that Avanti, everyone can go to it, which is brilliant. And it's just a shame that some faith schools don't allow that. So, yeah, Jay, I mean, what do you think about these points?
I think that's valid, because we talked a couple of weekends ago, Prerna, about extremism. And you may remember me making this observation that it is important in a modern, forward-thinking society to recognise that there are parts of our society into which religion should not intrude.
Yeah.
And I mentioned, for example, the health service, and I mentioned the civil service, the police, the military, and of course, today we're talking about education in particular. And I say this because it is essential that one recognizing that religion has its place in society, but it has a place. It doesn't have a dominant place. It has a place. And the responsibility for religious instruction is essentially one for parents. Children in the end will make up their own minds. When children grow up, some of them will continue to follow their parents' faith. Some will loosen their ties with their parents' faith. Some will become actually more passionate about their faith than even their parents were. And we're seeing that today, are we not, in Britain in 2014,
Yeah, no, of
where there's
course.
been a resurgence of religious attachment amongst a younger generation of all faiths, in fact. You see it everywhere. So in the end, it's up to young people to decide which way they want to go. The key point here is that in a good society, what you are teaching children are the tools for thinking, and for thinking with an open mind. And the only way you can teach children to be critical and open-minded about things is not to make them look at the world through one coloured lens. If you do that, they will begin to see the rest of the world in a way which is not happy and not complimentary.
I know, because they'll be like, everyone else is wrong and we're right, because
Quite.
I've been brought up in this way, and that's what I think's right and what I've been led to believe.
And that creates arrogance in thinking, which is dangerous to community cohesion. The minute people start saying, I come from the best religion in the world, and all of you other people, you don't really count because you're not part of my religion. We are on a very slippery slope.
Definitely.
Because that produces intolerance. Intolerance produces bigotry. Bigotry can lead to active discrimination. It can go on to much more than just discrimination. It can lead to violence. There are many, many routes to having a society which is broken by strong religious affiliation. But if you start this, if you lay those seeds within the school system, don't be surprised that when children are 16, 17, 18, they come out of school with a coloured form of thinking, which affects the way that they interact with their fellow citizens, and in a way which is not constructive. It is no surprise. If you breed that problem in schools, you pay
The price for it later.
very much so.
Definitely. We've got a call on the line, Jay from Bromley. Hi, Jay.
Oh, hello there.
Hi, thanks for calling in.
Yes, I was listening to this guy. Very important, actually. we must rescue education from the influence of the ruling class.
Okay. So
Education
religiously
education,
as well?
I beg your pardon?
So does that apply to religion as well?
That applies to religion as well. In fact, in our case, a whole country has been, a whole nation has been set up on the basis of religion. India and Pakistan.
Yeah, that's right.
So
Well, India actually does claim to be a secular society.
Well, it's very divisive, actually. But apart from religion, there are great divisions in society between traditional values and modern values.
Okay.
And this is reflected in education, private education, public education. The education in this country, like most Western countries, Europe and America, are based on class. In the case of America, it's based on finance. If you're wealthy, you go to the best schools. But class is very important in this country because this is a class-ridden country. And it is very difficult to reconcile the great divisions in society in Britain. The divisions are based either on religion or class or race or customs or values.
Okay. So what you're saying, you think religious schools are bad because they're dividing people based on religion?
Religious schools are not bad because religion plays a very important part in society.
Okay.
It is the lens through which, it's the ideological lens through which people see the world and the surrounding areas of the world. Its place in society. Religion is very important. But like everything else, with the passage of time, values become outmoded, becomes obsolete, and they are replaced by other values. The past always dominates the present, and the present, unsure about its future, on what to do next, keeps on repeating the mistakes of the past.
Can I just interject on this particular point? I think you're making, if I may say so, a very important point, and we've emphasised over and over again that religion obviously has its place in society, and we should encourage people, if they want to develop a religious ethos in their children, not just because it's a question of following a certain holy book, but because there are many aspects of religious values which teach wholesome systems of thinking to children, teach them to behave well, teach them to be respectful, teach them to love God, teach them to be good, not to lie, not to be dishonest. There are so many good values about any religion. You take any of the major world religions and you'll find the same thing. About this, we do not disagree. Everyone agrees that religion, of course, should be allowed to flourish to the extent that parents want their children to develop a religious sensibility. The issue here, however, is different. The issue here is we are not living in a theocratic state. We are living in a, at least outwardly, nominally, secular state in which we don't want, and I think the majority of people in this country say this, they do not want religion to dominate the landscape of society so much that children grow up thinking of themselves through, as you say, quite rightly, looking at a lens, which is a religious lens. That is the primary way in which they view themselves and others around them, because that will produce an unhealthy society. If people want to live in a society that is like that, a society which is theocratic, then they have the option to move to a society that is like that.
Exactly, I
But
agree.
one of the great things about being British, one of the great things about coming here, my parents coming here, was because they knew this was an open society where different faiths hopefully would be tolerated, where people could express their point of view without fear of being criticized or shouted down, where people could integrate on an equal footing, not on an unequal footing. And it's taken us decades and decades to get legislation on the statute books through the fights of communities up and down the country to have their equal rights. What an awful thing we are contemplating now, where equal rights, which have been so hard gained, could be scuppered because people now use religious schools or faith schools as a way of reintroducing discrimination through the back door. And the irony of it is this, is that our own communities, minority communities, are in danger of being the main people who are bringing in these discriminatory practices.
Definitely.
Isn't that a sad and ironic fact of us in 2014 after 50, 60 years of settling in this country?
May I make a final observation?
Yeah, please do.
This society, like every other society, including Indian society,
Okay.
the dominant ideas in society in various aspects of life, education, religion, equality, freedom, the dominant ideas are the ideas of its dominant class. Because the dominant class has got the necessary education, the ideology, the clout, they dominate society. It is their ideas that dominate and permeate the system.
Jay, I'm afraid I'm going to have to disagree with you on that. I mean, John Major, if we take him as an example, he didn't go to university. He didn't have any, sort of higher education, but he still became Prime Minister of the UK.
Yeah, but the exception doesn't prove the rule.
But it can happen. It doesn't. It's not a rule, because if it was a rule, everyone would be like that.
And Jay, can I add this point, and more perhaps a subtle point? You may be right. You may well be right that the so-called dominant class dominates the education system because it can pay for its children to have a private education, which gives them a competitive advantage in the workplace and in the university selection systems. You're absolutely right about that. But you know what's happening, Jay? What's happening is that those schools which are faith schools, which are able to select their intake and which are successful academically because they exclude children that they think are going to bring down the average academic performance, children who may have special needs, children who may be from lower income families, who may not have books at home, who may not have encouragement from parents to be able to read freely at home. Those schools, which are faith schools, which are becoming increasingly successful academically, are doing exactly what you're saying the dominant class was doing. They are creating a generation, potentially, of successful people who went to a really good school, but who come from a certain faith.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, although it won't replace the dominant class, it is becoming another class of people who are dominant. And those people eventually will become influential in society. If they went to a faith school, they were successful academically, they went to a good university, they got a great job, they earned a lot of money, they became people of high status, they go into society with certain religious beliefs. And when they occupy positions of power, Jay, when they become senior politicians or lawyers or whatever they happen to be as their success stories unfold, those people in turn will think, the reason why I'm here and the reason why I'm successful is because of my religion, not because this society gave me an opportunity, forgetting that it was taxpayers who paid for their school to give them the benefit of that superior education. Now, Jay, that cannot be an acceptable situation. So you're right, but I think that your point is an incomplete point. It needs to have added to it the fact that faith schools are now becoming the aristocracy of schools. They are becoming the schools where children get a better education, and they're doing so unfairly and to the detriment of other kids who are being left behind. And I, as a citizen of this country who believes in equality, I cannot I cannot stand by and say nothing when I see children being left out of a good education system simply because their parents do not have, quote unquote, the right religion.
Jay, thank you very much for your phone call.
Okay.
Thank you, Jay. Bye.
Bye.
We've had another text come in from Feroz. He said, religion should not enter schools at all. We are doing so badly in the World League table that we should concentrate on studies alone. I think that's a very fair point. I mean, religion must take up quite a lot of the proportion of time of these faith schools. And if that was put to, a different use...
It's the same question, isn't it, Prerna? Is the fact that faith schools are doing so well, many of them are doing so well academically, because they are faith schools or because they're selective? Here's the simple analogy. The private school system, generally speaking, brings about much better results than the state school system, generally.
Yeah,
right?
it's selective.
So it's selective.
Yeah.
Well, they're selective because they want to make sure that their grades are high so that parents continue to pay money to send their children to those private schools. It's not because they're from a certain faith or any other reason. It's because they're selective. If you introduce selection into any local school, you will create the outcome that you desire, which is better results at the other end of the pipeline.
Definitely.
So we need to be careful not to be tricked into this trap, actually, that people who believe in faith schools put around, which is, yeah, but you can't criticize faith schools. Look how good their results are. Forgetting, of course, that they've been very careful about who they take in at the bottom end.
Yeah.
All right, so that we're coming back to the same point over and over again, that it's selection that produces certain outcomes. It's not the religion that produces certain outcomes.
Yeah. I would definitely agree with you on that. We've had a text from Jaspal who said people should be given choices in education, and if people choose to educate their children with like-minded community, why not? But I mean, that's
fine.
a fair point.
I'll say the answer to that is fine. You pay for it.
Yeah, it shouldn't be funded by the state.
That's fine. You want to send your child to a private school, you pay for it. You want to drive a Mercedes car, you pay for it.
Yeah.
Okay? You want to enjoy all sorts of things that you feel give your children and your family an added advantage, you pay for it. But don't expect other people to pay for it. So if you want to have a religious instruction in faith schools and you love that idea, no one will complain as long as you pay for it. And as long as it's compliant with the law of this land, you can have any arrangement you like. Remember, Jaspal, if you want to teach your children at home because you just don't trust the school system at all,
you can do that as well.
There's a provision to do that too. So we have a society which allows all manner of ways in which we can teach our young people. But the question arises, who's paying for it?
Yeah, no, it's true. We've had another text in from Mohan as well. He said faith schools breed intolerance to others, which is what we'd been talking about. Because I think when a child goes to school, it's a very crucial time in their developing and learning. And if they're kind of instructed in a certain way, when they're then, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, when they join society at a later stage, they'll have a completely different way of thinking than everyone else. And I think it does segregate people.
And Prerna, I mean, you've been to university not that many years ago.
Yes.
I've no doubt that you will have noticed, because it's been a few decades since I've been to university. When I was at university, I didn't notice that religion had any particular place on our campus. But you will have noticed that religion is playing an increasing role on people's on university campuses. So we are seeing now the effect of the ongoing impact of a religious sensibility being driven into young minds at a young age when they get to university, and then it goes beyond. So the same wonderful, intelligent young men and women who are graduating from a university system, who may have gone to a faith school, will eventually enter the professions and all other parts of society, and they bring with them this certain perspective, this lens that we heard about earlier from Jay. Is that what we want?
Definitely
As
not.
a society which is tolerant, is that what we want? Or do we want people to become professionals, doctors, lawyers, or working in a factory or working in the civil service, who say, when I step into my workplace, I leave my religion behind. I pick up my religion when I exit through the front door of the hospital. And I go home and I practice my religion. And I teach my children when I'm at home. And I go to my local temple, mosque, or gurdwara or church. And I develop my children's sense of their religious identity there. But when I walk into my workplace, I leave my religion behind. Why? Because the people who are in my workplace are not all of the same religion as I am. And they don't deserve, and they shouldn't be subjected to hearing about my religious beliefs or having it in their face all the time. You celebrate religious diversity without imposing it in a way that makes people feel threatened.
No,
because if you make them threatened, Prerna, all that happens is they react, and they may not have been particularly religious before, but by golly, they're now going to think, I'm feeling that my religion is becoming sidelined. Perhaps I should be sending my child to a religious school. And this becomes a competition. And before you know it, you're in a Northern Irish situation where Catholics and Protestants are at each other's throats for no other reason than the fact that they come from different communities and sectarianism rules the day. That's not what we want here. And I hope that most people believe that there are ways and means to prevent that from happening. Perhaps we should think about schooling as being the beginning of that process and instilling the sort of values that I, as a child, back in the early 70s, we are talking a long time ago, felt that that was a good thing, that I was taught by my teachers not to be concerned about religion. They taught us religion and all the world religions, and I have, I hope to say, a very good grounding in all the great world religions, okay, because of my teaching at school. But no one particular religion dominated, and I'm very thankful for that because it makes me a more tolerant person today.
Definitely. I mean, if people are going to face schools where women are sitting at the back of the classroom or, you know, perceived in a certain way, I mean, what is that child going to learn when they go into life? They're going to be thinking, okay, women should always be at the back of the queue. I mean, it is, you know, sex discrimination. I mean, we've just got a couple of text messages we'll quickly get through. Vina texted in saying self-imposed apartheid is what we are doing to our children, which is, it goes back to your earlier point, Jay, doesn't it?
That's a really strong and actually vivid way of describing. When I talked about segregation in South Africa earlier and in the United States before the civil rights movement took hold, that was a form of apartheid.
No,
and this is religious apartheid. You see a school in which all the children are from one religious faith. You open the school gates at 3:30 and they all swarm out onto the street of one religious faith, and the rest of the community is looking on and thinking, they don't want to be part of us,
yeah,
so should we be part of them? And that is not an image which I would want my younger daughters to see and think, well, that defines what Britain is in 2014.
No, definitely. I mean, we've got a phone call from Mahinder Singh from Seven Kings. He said it's a very good topic. Well done. So thank you very much for calling us, Mahinder. We're coming to the end of the show, but I mean, it's been a great topic. I think it's really opened my eyes about religious schools and what they can and can't do. And it's amazing how, you know, they can be religiously discriminatory and sex discriminatory as well, which I think is shocking.
And as part of this reasonable conversation, I'll say, Prerna, and I applaud you and the station for holding these conversations. We need to make sure that what we believe in the end, is what is a good society.
Definitely. And we'll be joined with Joe next week as well, and also Diana Nami, the director of Iranian and Kurdish Women's Rights Organisation, where we'll be talking about gender discrimination, which will be interesting. Thank you very much, Joe. Bye.